She wore a black turtleneck and a whisper of certainty. Investors handed her hundreds of millions. Patients trusted their lives to a machine that, in secret, barely existed. How do you sell a miracle that never worked? Hold that question. We'll unpack it. Imagine a quiet boardroom in Palo Alto. A woman in her late 20s stands at the front. Her voice is soft, measured. She speaks like a founder who has already thought 3 moves ahead. She does not shout. Her presence commands the room. Money follows. Then imagine a lab corridor lit like a hospital at 2 in the morning. Technicians whisper, machines hum. A small stack of papers contradicts the glossy investor deck. Someone types an email they never wanted to send. That email becomes the crack that splits a company's image into ruin. This is the story of how Elizabeth Holmes became, briefly, the world's youngest female billionaire, and how that billion-dollar aura was built on a pitch more than on proof. It is also a forensic study of how the machinery of belief, aesthetics, narrative, social proof, secrecy, can be weaponized to turn prestige into piles of capital. We will follow the money. We will follow the pitch. We will follow the people who spoke up when the story stopped matching the data. Pause on the voice. Listen to how the pitch works. Theranos began as a simple, seductive promise. A tiny prick of blood, a few drops, and a lab's worth of answers. No vials, no long waits. A revolution compressed into a cartridge. In an industry that prizes precision and proof, the pitch offered an elegant shortcut. Beauty and simplicity would replace complexity. Investors do not invest in small, slow ideas. They invest in category killers. Elizabeth Holmes sold the category. She borrowed a language and an image that had already proven magnetic at the intersection of commerce and culture. The black turtleneck was not costume alone. It was a visual shortcut to a precedent, the posture of industrial authority made famous by Steve Jobs. That posture carries an entire set of inferences. It says, there is a single visionary who sees past limits. It promises technological inevitability. On stage, she did not simply explain a product. She choreographed belief. Demonstrations were short, the narrative was minimal and powerful, and access was tightly controlled. Interested parties were granted curated views. There were private demos in sanitized rooms, excluded tests, and a litany of non-disclosure agreements that made independent verification difficult. Information was a funnel. Investors were invited in, but only on the company's terms. The money came. Roughly $700 million flowed into Theranos from elite corners. Family offices that treasure legacy and a quiet power. Venture dollars that chase asymmetric returns. And prestige investors who saw a chance to claim ownership of the future. Those checks were not just capital. They were endorsements that multiplied credibility. In private clubs and at gated dinners, who you backed mattered as much as what you backed. When billionaires and their families place big bets, the bet becomes a social event with ripple effects. Why did these sophisticated investors say yes? Forensic economics points to several forces working together. First, scarcity. Theranos claimed to be on the cusp of a platform so disruptive it did not yet exist in the marketplace. Scarcity breeds urgency. Second, authority cues. The visual and rhetorical mimicry of a recognized pioneer reduced the cognitive cost of trusting. Third, social proof. A roster of high-profile backers signaled safety to others who might otherwise be skeptical. Fourth, narrative value. A founder with a dramatic personal story, a Stanford dropout on a mission to democratize health, activates emotion, which is decisive when data are incomplete. Finally, there was a structural quirk of venture capital itself. Performance is rarely linear, and the calculus favors outsized upside. So optimism is not merely tolerated, it is priced in. At the center of that calculus stood the pitch. We can dissect it like a crime scene. Its elements were familiar, predictable, and precise. First, the frame. Holmes stated a moral purpose: to eliminate painful venipuncture and bring diagnostics to everyone. Moral framing cushions risk. It reframes financial upside as social progress. Investors like to align profit with purpose. It's a double payoff. Second, the iconography. Her stagecraft borrowed from a playbook that already sold billions. The black turtleneck simplified perception. Fewer visual variables make a speaker easier to process. The effect is subtle, but powerful. An audience expends less mental energy parsing visual cues and more energy accepting assertions. That is the space where claims can take root without ritualized scrutiny. Third, the demo. Demonstrations in technology pitches are persuasive precisely because they are visceral. But demos are fragile. Without reproducibility, they are theater. Theranos' demos were tightly managed. Equipment was vetted. Tests were pre-selected, and observers were kept at a distance from raw data. Feeling the machine hum is persuasive, but not every hum equals functioning science. Fourth, information control. Theranos guarded its protocols and data with legal and practical constraints. NDA after NDA, compartmentalized labs, and a culture where questions were framed as betrayals. This is the inverse of the scientific method. Science survives doubt. The pitch, by contrast, penalized it. Fifth, endorsement. Boards lined up. Names of respected figures, people with public reputations for wisdom, appeared beside the companies. This is not gossip, it's capital alchemy. Endorsement can substitute for evidence in social cascades. When a group of reputable actors positions itself behind a company, many observers take the endorsement as implicit due diligence. So the environment was primed. The pitch is made. The checks arrive. Valuation swells. Elizabeth Holmes's public profile becomes a narrative device. The young woman who will change medicine. She appears on magazine covers and at tech summits. Vanity metrics multiply. Profiles, glossy features, and the unconfirmed assumption that if the mainstream press sings in chorus, the thesis must be sound. And yet, under the polished sheen, things break down. Whistleblowers, people inside labs and operations, began to see inconsistencies. Their notes, their emails, their late-night conversations painted a different picture. About 90% of patient tests, they revealed, were run on secret commercial machines, not on the purported Theranos devices. That is not a small deviation. 90% changes the story from selective outsourcing to systemic substitution. Imagine being a lab tech who is told that a device is ready, but every reliable result is produced by something else. Imagine the moral friction of certifying tests for external use that you know were not processed by the claimed technology. It was a kind of cognitive collapse inside the company. The public narrative demanded a miracle, while the internal operations produced ordinary, sometimes improvised, solutions. The whistleblowers did more than leak numbers. They drew lines between practice and promise. Their disclosures were the fissures that let daylight in. Investigations began. Media scrutiny intensified. The valuation that had been built on aura now faced a forensic audit. At this point, two kinds of blindness become visible in the story. One is the blindness of the market. Investors had not insisted on open, reproducible data in a field where reproducibility is the baseline. They accepted demonstrations and signatures and reputations instead. The second is the organizational blindness of the company. A culture that punishes questions and rewards theatrical certainty cannot self-correct. In that mix, small errors become systematic failures. Pause here and consider a single scene. A founder in a room, flanked by lawyers and PR people, invited to refute charges by a reporter. The tone is calm. The explanations are neat. Yet behind the words, private emails and lab logs stack up like evidence in a drawer. That drawer opens. The company culture frays. Contracts are renegotiated. Partnerships with retail chains wobble. Boards of directors convene in confidential rooms. The cascade is not immediate, but it is inevitable once trust fractures. I want to give you a quiet invitation now. If this narrative is keeping your attention and you want more deep dives like this, subscribe. It helps us keep exploring these forensic stories in a calm, thoughtful way. After the whistleblowers' accounts went public, legal consequences followed. Regulators stepped in. Lawsuits multiplied. Investors faced losses. The human cost was not limited to balance sheets. Patients who had trusted blood tests for diagnoses and decisions deserved better data. Careers were altered. Reputations were scarred. From a forensic economics viewpoint, there are several lasting lessons. First, image can masquerade as innovation in the short term, but capital markets eventually seek evidence. Second, prestige is not the same as proof. Family office checks and celebrity board members can accelerate growth, but they cannot replace rigorous validation. Third, the psychology of persuasion matters in finance. Mimicry of authority, confidence cues, and staged scarcity are powerful tools. They can create a speeded-up cycle of funding that outpaces the slower, necessary process of scientific validation. There is a final layer, the cultural template this created for a generation of investors and founders. Tech culture often prizes narrative audacity. Biotech and diagnostics demand methodological rigor. The mismatch here was dangerous. When the aesthetics of Silicon Valley met the exacting standards of laboratory science without a bridge of reproducible data, the result was not just corporate failure, it was a public warning. Consider a checklist built from this forensic reading, a tool for investors and the curious. Have you demanded reproducible data? Have you verified independent third-party validation? Are demos verifiable outside a curated environment? Is the board equipped to challenge a charismatic founder? These are not academic questions. They matter when lives and large amounts of capital are at stake. Narrative power still matters. But so does skepticism. And not the cynical kind, the disciplined kind. The kind that asks for raw protocols, for peer-reviewed results, for transparent supply chains. The kind that treats an investment in health technology as both a financial decision and a moral obligation. As the story of Theranos entered the courts and the public record, the image of the black turtleneck lingered in the cultural imagination. It remains a symbol of how presentation can be conflated with proof. The forensics of the pitch teach us to look past the costume. Look to the instrument panels, the lab logs, the reproducible results. Let us come back to a human moment. Years later, in small-town clinics and city hospitals, technicians and clinicians carry on their work. They read charts, calibrate machines, and reconcile test results with patient symptoms. For them, the story is not a headline. It is a quiet reminder about standards. When trust is shaken at scale, it takes routine labor and consistent verification to rebuild it. The collapse of Theranos also left a sharper lesson for investors who manage generational wealth. Family offices that placed large, concentrated bets learned the hard way about guarding against narrative contagion. Diversification is not only a risk management tool, it is an inoculation against the bandwagon of prestige. In some cases, lessons from this episode changed investment governance. More insistence on technical due diligence, more external audits, fresher evaluation criteria that separate story from science. The final act in this particular story is not only legal closure, it is a cultural reckoning. The magic of a compelling speaker, the power of a simple visual cue, the thrill of being first. These forces do not disappear, but their unchecked marriage to complex science can have real consequences. The balance we must strike is between optimism and discipline, between charismatic storytelling and transparent evidence. As we wind toward the end of this listening experience, hear the tension return, but in a different register. The tension between what we want to be true and what we can prove. That tension is the engine of responsible innovation. It demands both imagination and restraint. In personal terms, each of us carries a version of this lesson. When we make decisions about investments, careers, or health, it is worth asking who benefits from our belief. Does the pitch clarify risk, or does it obscure it? Are we investing with eyes open, or are we swept along by the spectacle? The Theranos story is dramatic, but it is also instructive. It teaches us to read pitches as forensic objects, to note the props, to question the demos, to trace the money. It asks us to respect the disciplines of the fields we enter with our capital and our trust. If this reflection felt useful, consider subscribing for more forensic stories about how money, power, and persuasion collide. We'll keep these deep dives calm and thorough. We close with a quieter, practical thought. In an era where narrative moves quickly and capital moves faster, the best defense is a simple regimen. Insist on reproducibility, demand independent verification, and prioritize process over performance when lives might be affected. Look for the instruments, not the costume. Check the raw data, not just the deck. Hold founders to the standards of the fields they claim to disrupt. A pitch can inspire a revolution. It can also conceal a failure. Learning to tell the difference is both a civic and an economic skill. It protects patients, investors, and the institutions that ought to serve them. Thank you for listening. If you'd like more calm, investigative stories that trace how big ideas meet real-world checks, subscribe and stay with us. We'll keep doing the careful work of following the money, the science, and the people in between.